Wanda and Cosmo glanced at each other, realizing that Timmy did in fact have a point. His parents had always neglected him while going off to do their own thing, while Vicky was sent over to his house to watch over him, only to be constantly bullied and even tortured at times by her. Not once they even did to look more in depth at what exactly was going on between Timmy and Vicky, nor did they even consider how he felt. Although Timmy had friends, he still had been alone and miserable for most of his life until Cosmo and Wanda were assigned to him as fairy godparents. Their wishing powers granted many of Timmy's desires to an extent depending on the rules, and this really made him happy, joyous, and even more, there were still times where it felt down in the dumps. Thinking more about it, Cosmo and Wanda couldn't exactly blame Timmy for being so angry at his parents. In a twisted sort of way, they were partly responsible for putting Timmy in situations where Vicky was able to have her way with him. "You do have a point there, hun," Wanda said. "Your parents weren't exactly the brightest bulbs on the closet, but they never really seemed to take you very seriously. But I know for a fact that they still love you very much." Timmy spun around with an angry expression and said, "If they really did love me like they said, then they would have listened to me and done something about Vicky. But they didn't, and always before they started hiring Vicky to babysit me, they never ever spent any time with me. Like, on some occasions they would, but mainly spend more time on their own rather than me, since I'm always alone with my two friends, Chester and AJ, to keep me company. But even still, that wasn't enough to make me feel any better." "He's got a point there, Wanda," Cosmo pointed out. Wanda wasn't really sure what to say. Timmy did have a sort of a point. His parents never really fully listened to him or took his feelings into consideration before, and even before they weren't the smartest individuals around. So it wasn't really wonder that Timmy was often neglected and not taken seriously by them. While Wanda knew for a fact that his parents still loved him, she still had to admit that they were still very lazy and not too motivated at actually wanting to spend more time with with their own son. Because of this, Timmy was constantly lonely and often bullied by others, including Vicky. "Not gonna lie, but Cosmo does have a point too," Wanda replied. "Your parents have always been thinking about more of their own needs rather than yours, so I can understand how you felt, but still love you very much." "Wanda's right, Timmy," Cosmo nodded. "And think about it. Vicky's finally been caught, and she'll probably end up in jail for a very long time for her crimes, so you wouldn't have to worry about her ever again." "I am aware of that," Timmy replied disdainfully, "and I'll admit that I'm glad Vicky's getting locked up for what she did. But that doesn't mean everything's fine. I still can't get what happened in the hospital out of my head, and it's making me lose my sanity. I can't eat or sleep normally, or even so much as live my life without being reminded of it. Just hearing certain words or voices that sound remotely like something from the inside that surgery room terrifies me." "That's called PTSD, hun," Wanda replied in a sad voice. "Lots of people sometimes go through that for traumatic experiences that ever happened to them in their lives. But you're strong, and I am very confident that you'll overcome with it as time passes." "No," Timmy said flatly, "not from something like this." "Please don't say that, sport," Cosmo replied. "It'll certainly take a long time, but with help, I'm sure you'll be able to move on from what happened in the hospital." Timmy glanced down at the floor, and then with a frustrated expression, then said, "No, I won't. I can't." He then headed towards the window and opened it up. "Timmy, where are you going?" Cosmo asked as Timmy stepped outside. "Nowhere, just the treehouse," he replied, with no emotion. Timmy then climbed to the treehouse just outside the window and entered his treehouse, trying to take his mind off the surgery and Vicky. No matter what he did, though, Timmy couldn't get out of his head. He curled up into a ball near the left corner of the treehouse and shut his eyes, trying to shut out the abyss around him. All Timmy wanted was to forget about the horrible nightmare from the other day. Yet wishing for it was not an option in this case either. He didn't even know if he would feel peaceful again, even with Vicky in prison, although Timmy knew that he most likely will have to never deal with Vicky again once she was convicted in court. But it still didn't change by the fact that his sanity had been scared by a pure evil little prank in that surgery room. Vicky would be haunted by it forever. Tears ran down his face as images of sharp scalpel and buzzsaws slicing into him rushed through his mind. No, that's gone. That's past. Don't think about it, Timmy yelled in his mind, trying to shut up those nightmarish images out. He tried picturing himself with Trixie and all the others who cared about him. Then that haunting image of Vicky's evil sneering face from the other side of the surgery room window flashed through Timmy's mind again, making his stress rise even further. It was too much for him, and all Timmy could do was break down in tears. No, Timmy whimpered as he trembled into the treehouse floor. It hurts, no! He slammed his eyes shut again, trying to control himself, but he couldn't. Timmy's mind was too much in a mess. He couldn't even think about it any straighter. He simply sobbed uncontrollably. He slammed his eyes shut again. But of course, Timmy, are you alright? He wanted the nightmare to end. A voice suddenly asked him. Timmy opened his eyes and saw Cosmo and Wanda hovering over above him, looking very worried. From what he could tell, Wanda had been the one who asked him that question. Oh, Wanda? Timmy sniffled, sitting up and slowly wiping his eyes. I'm fine. I just... Timmy was cut off as Wanda suddenly flew down and embraced him tightly. Sweetie, don't say anything, she replied, in a smoothing voice, with tears running down her face. Just let it all out, hun. Timmy trembled as he embraced Wanda and sobbed uncontrollably on her shoulder. He had never cried this much before, but who could blame him? Timmy had gone through a nightmarish experience that no one, let alone a child, should ever have to go through. Cosmo also embraced Timmy as well, feeling the tears running down his face as well. Timmy, I'm so sorry. We can't just make you forget what happened back there, but I promise that we'll do our best to help you pass this time, Cosmo said calmly. Timmy sniffled and wiped his eyes, but the sorrow still didn't leave him. No amount of wishes he could undo the sorrow, the pain within Timmy's mind, and neither did trying to shut the horrifying memories out of his head. Timmy fought hard and came only to conclusion. There was only one way to end the pain. One method that he knew would work permanently. If it was a terrifying idea, but at this point, Timmy's mind was so broken that he didn't care anymore. But there's actually one wish that might help me, Timmy stammered. There is? Cosmo asked curiously. Yes, Timmy replied, and said, I wish to be on top of the tallest skyscraper in Dimsdale. Cosmo and Wanda looked at each other in confusion, wondering why Timmy would wish for something like that. Nevertheless, they granted it, and they raised their now glowing wands, and they were all teleported away from the treehouse and rematerialized on the very top of a tall building in the middle of Dimsdale City. The wind blew gently as Timmy gazed out across the sky, then felt his heart beginning to pound at the thought of what he was about to do. Timmy, why did you wish to come all the way up here? Wanda asked in confusion. You still trying to find a place to be alone? Cosmo added. Timmy turned to his head to face his fairy godparents with a smile. Then he said in a sad yet calm voice, Cosmo, Wanda, I wanted to thank you both for always being there for me when my parents couldn't. You made my life so happy, even when it still wasn't. I'm still very honored to have you saved your home world from the darkness. Cosmo and Wanda grew concerned by what Timmy was saying. This sounded like a bit suspicious. Why are you telling us this now, Timmy? Cosmo asked worriedly. Timmy sighed and then said, It's because there's only one way for me to truly end my suffering. And since the memories can't be erased, he then paused and glanced over at the bridge of the roof, feeling his heart race even more as they slowly began to approach it. As soon as Timmy started towards the edge, Cosmo and Wanda's eyes widened in absolute horror upon realizing what that Timmy was planning to do. No, you don't mean... Cosmo gasped in shock. Oh God, Timmy, no! Wanda exclaimed in horror. I'm sorry, you two, but I can't go on like this, Timmy replied, stopping briefly to glance back at them, now with tears running down his face. It's just too much for me to handle. I can't do anything anymore without being reminded of what happened back at the hospital. I'm sorry if it has to come down to this. I just want the pain to end, and this is the only way. He only rushed towards the edge of the building, with Cosmo and Wanda following behind him, trying to get him to stop. Timmy came to a halt just next to the edge and saw how far down the drop was. He was all over at least over 100-foot drop down to the ground. It made Timmy feel very nervous. He wondered if it would hurt when it hit the bottom, but it doesn't matter much. Timmy had already been through enough more pain than anyone else ever had in their life, so he didn't care if his last few seconds alive were painful. At least my pain and suffering will be over, Timmy thought as he prepared to jump. Timmy, please, don't do this. I'm begging you. You're still too young. You have so much to live for. Wanda begged him with tears in her eyes. It doesn't have to be like this, Timmy. You'll get over this, I promise, Cosmo pleaded. Timmy simply smiled with tears staining down his face. Then said, Don't worry about me anymore. You both were the best godparents as a kid could ever have. And I love you both so much. Always have and always will. Farewell. Before Cosmo and Wanda could stop Timmy, he then walked over towards his one arm with his arms spread out in a flying position, shut his eyes and leaped out of the edge of the building. No, Timmy! Wanda screamed in horror, then quickly flew after him. Timmy, come back! Cosmo yelled, flying after Wanda. Timmy could have seen just below them, falling faster each second, almost going too fast for Wanda and Cosmo to keep up. As Timmy continued falling, he wondered that if it would be like to die. He was never a religious person, but he did believe that there was an afterlife, and Timmy hoped that whatever the afterlife awaited him, he'll find an everlasting peace waiting for him there. Mom, Dad, everyone, I'm sorry, Timmy thought as he continued to fall, waiting for the exact moment to hit the ground. Up above, Cosmo and Wanda tried harder and harder than ever to keep up with Timmy. It just wasn't easy. He was falling much too fast. Wanda, we're never gonna catch him. He's falling too fast, and someone might see us, Cosmo called out from behind Wanda. Realizing that Cosmo had a point, she glanced back and yelled, Transform yourself into what I do and follow me. I have an idea. Wanda quickly transformed into a hawk and sped downwards much faster than before. Cosmo did the same thing and followed close behind Wanda. What's the plan, Wanda? I don't think we'll be able to hold Timmy up in these forms. He's too big and heavy, Cosmo called out. I know, Wanda replied. That's why we're getting far enough below Timmy. We'll transform ourselves into giant airbags to soften Timmy's fall. The two of them got sped down faster than ever before, then slowly got underneath Timmy. The ground was coming up fast, and the two fairies could see Timmy headed straight for the large parked limousine below. No one seemed to be nearby for whatever reason, so this meant Cosmo and Wanda wouldn't have to worry about being seen. He's headed straight for that black limo, Cosmo. Land on top of it and transform, Wanda called out, speeding straight for the front of the roof of the limousine. She eventually landed on top of it. It quickly transformed into a giant airbag to soften Timmy's fall. Cosmo had also landed on top of a large pink airbag to transform into one as well. Eventually, Timmy reached the impact zone slammed straight right into Wanda and Cosmo's airbags. The force of the impact was so powerful, even though the two airbags softened his fall, Timmy still ended up going right through them and hit the limousine's roof, putting a massive dent in it. Timmy felt an enormous jolt of sharp pain through his entire body. At that moment it made contact with the limo. He was still pretty sure he felt some of his bones break. Timmy's head had also swarmed like crazy, as he felt his unconsciousness beginning to fade quickly. The last thing Timmy heard was the sound of a girl screaming in horror, and then he blacked out. It turned out the person screaming happened to be none other than Trixie Tang, and she still had been inside the limo when Timmy hit it. Wanda and Cosmo had quickly transformed back into hawks, just as Trixie got out of the limo and rushed up to the lamppost to avoid being seen. "Timmy, my God!" Trixie yelled in horror upon seeing Timmy laying straight up on top of the limousine. "Miss Tang, what's going on? Did something fell on us?" Mr. Tang asked, quickly stepping out of the driver's side. "It's Timmy! He fell on top of the limo!" Trixie replied in shock while inspecting the damage. Timmy lay dead center on top of the middle of the limo's roof and had a huge dent in it. He had blood streaming down from his nose, and had several of the windows had been shattered from the force of the impact. From what Trixie could tell, it appeared as if Timmy had fallen from the building straight next to the limo, and Mr. Tang had the same idea as well. "My God, the kid must have jumped off of this building. Why would he do such a thing?" Mr. Tang wondered. Trixie had gotten a call on her cell phone and called for the ambulance as Mr. Tang checked for Timmy for a pulse. Fearing for the worst, once Trixie ended the call, she climbed on top of the limo and kneeled down next to Timmy, gazing up at her father with a frightened expression on her face. "Dad, is he?" She paused at the sentence, not even wanting to say it. "He's alive, yes," Mr. Tang replied, upon finding a pulse on Timmy's wrist. "Timmy's got a pulse, but it's very weak though. He needs a doctor right away." Upon the lamppost, Cosmo and Wanda felt a rush of relief run through them as they heard Trixie's father announce that Timmy was still alive. But it was clear that he had been badly injured from the fall. Blood was running down from his nose, and right near the bottom of Timmy's shirt was a large amount of blood began to staining it bright red. Trixie noticed this and gently lifted Timmy's shirt, only way to see that his surgical wound from his recent surgery had opened up slightly near the sides and oozing out a ton of blood. "Oh no!" Trixie exclaimed in shock. "Dad, Timmy's got an open wound on his stomach, and I think it's from his recent appendix removal surgery he had. The force of the impact must have ripped it open." Mr. Tang inspected the wound and found it bleeding rapidly. He grabbed a large towel from inside the limo and gently pressed it against the wound to stop the bleeding. "I heard about that just recently," Mr. Tang replied. "Word's gone around that Timmy's babysitter, Vicky, has been arrested for sabotaging his surgery, and with a ton of other crimes as well. I can't believe she'll do something so cruel to a kid like that." "Neither can I," Trixie said in disgust tone. "I always knew Vicky was cold and heartless and nasty, but I never thought she'd go that far as she did. I can't imagine what Timmy..." Trixie then paused as a horrible thought came into her mind. She had recently and already been aware of Vicky's siblings, that her own sister had sabotaged Timmy's surgery, causing him to wake up and experience the whole thing, including the extreme pain of being operated on. Soon after, the news had spread around like wildfire, and now almost all of Dimsdale knew about it, including Trixie and her friend Veronica. Trixie didn't even want to believe at first, but after Timmy's own parents actually admitted it to his friends, she felt absolutely disgusted with Vicky for putting Timmy through something so nightmarish like that. This made Trixie realize why Timmy must have jumped off the building, and it brought her to tears. "Oh God," Trixie gasped, gazing down at Timmy in horror. "Dad, I think I know why Timmy jumped off the building." "You do?" Mr. Tang asked. Trixie nodded, then said, I think I think Timmy was trying to take his own life because of what Vicky did to him in the hospital. I don't even know if I'm right, but I can't think of any other logical answer as to why he would do such a thing. Actually, if you think about it, that would make perfect sense, Mr. Tang said. Any 10-year-old kid went through something like that would most likely be left with pretty much messed up thoughts afterwards. Trixie knelt down and gently shook Timmy, trying to get him to wake up, but he wouldn't move. He was out cold. Tears from Trixie's face fell into Timmy's shirt as she tried waking him up, fearing for his life. Wanda and Cosmo were actually equally worried as well, fearing that if their best godson, even though through the airbag egg forms has softened Timmy's fall, he still landed with enough force to go through them and hit the limo, causing him to have some bad injuries. It had not been all for Timmy's godparents, he'd most certainly have died from such a fall. Timmy, please wake up, Trixie pleaded gently, lifting him from the roof of the limo. Careful, he might have internal injuries we don't know about, Mr. Tang warned. Before Trixie could respond, a loud wailing of the ambulance siren could soon be heard approaching, followed by several sirens behind it. A large ambulance, a fire engine, and 2 police cars arrived on scene. Several paramedics exited out of the ambulance through the back with a stretcher in hand, while several firefighters began examining the scene. The officers took statements from Mr. Tang as Trixie hands Timmy over to the EMTs. I take it you're the one who called? One of the EMTs asked Trixie. Yes, I did, Trixie replied, wiping tears from her face. I think Timmy's jumped off of a building right next to the limo and fell on it. My dad thinks he was trying to take his own life. One of his officers overheard Trixie mentioning Timmy by the name, rushed over to the limo as the EMT began loading Timmy onto the stretcher bed. Wait a sec, that's the Turner kid. They just called the station earlier to report their son has gone missing, the officer exclaimed upon identifying Timmy on the stretcher. Oh boy, the Turners aren't going to like this. Will Timmy be alright? Trixie asked the EMTs as Timmy was being loaded up into the ambulance. I'm not sure, Miss Tang. We'll try and get him to the hospital right away to be examined, one of the EMTs replied as they climbed inside. Once the EMTs were inside, they closed down the rear doors and the ambulance sped off into the hospital with lights and sirens running. Cosmo and Wanda quickly took off into the air as they followed close behind the ambulance in their hawk forms to avoid being seen. Wanda, you don't think Timmy's gonna... Cosmo began. Don't say it, Cosmo, Wanda cut him off. He'll make it. He's a strong kid. Much stronger than any other child we have been assigned to in the past. But you heard Mr. Tang. Timmy's pulse is weak, Cosmo reminded. That doesn't mean all hope is lost, Wanda countered as she struggled to keep up with the ambulance. Deep down, however, Wanda had her own doubts. Timmy had clearly sustained injuries from that fall, and even after falling onto her and Cosmo, along with in their airbag forms, he had lost a lot of blood from his surgical wound, reopening from the force of the impact. Wanda was no doctor, but she was sure that Timmy probably would have a concussion from the fall as well as he was unconscious. Wanda couldn't believe it had to come to it, but things had gone from bad to worse so quickly. Why didn't they see things from the moment Timmy wished to be on top of the building? I'm such a fool, Wanda thought, as the hospital came close to up view ahead. Once she and Cosmo reached the hospital, they followed the ambulance over to the ER parking, where it stopped near the ER entrance. The rear doors opened, and then the EMTs could be seen wheeling Timmy into the hospital. There they are, Wanda, Timmy pointed out. I can see them, Wanda replied, aiming for the ER windows below. Transform into a housefly. The 2 fairies then transformed into houseflies and flew right through the ER doors just as they began closing. Then they began looking around for Timmy. There he is, Cosmo pointed out. Wanda then turned into the direction Cosmo pointed out and saw the EMTs wheeling Timmy into an examination room. They then flew in that direction and saw a doctor and several nurses lifting Timmy into the examination table. The two fairies then flew into the examination room and landed on top of the examination lamps hanging from above, giving them a view of the whole room. One of the nurses seemed to recognize Timmy because Wanda and Cosmo heard him say, "God, this kid's Timmy Turner, the same one who had his appendix removed the other day. What happened to him?" Based on the info we received from Trixie Tang, he fell into a limo about a 100-foot building. How he managed to survive it? I'll never know, one of the EMTs informed. Wanda and Cosmo then watched as the doctors and nurses began to treat Timmy's injuries. They removed his shirt and gave him a full view of his injuries he had received from the fall. The stitches on Timmy's surgical wound had ripped halfway near the bottom, causing a large amount of blood to pour out of his gut. Several large bruises could have been seen on Timmy's chest near his ribs, and then the nurses checked his head. A large bloody wound could be seen near the bottom where it hit the limo. As Cosmo and Wanda watched the hospital staff working on Timmy, the door suddenly swung open, revealing his parents, accompanied by two other nurses.